Video 2. As a PSVR user, I love seeing new additions added to the PSVR catalog, so the other day when I saw Mervils, a VR adventure added to the catalog for just $20, I knew that it was something I needed to look into. After a brief Google search, I found out that it had originally been released on PC and had positive reviews. In fact, the only negative review left for the game was from someone complaining about not being able to run the game on his Rift, which was both an isolated incident and irrelevant to me. Out of the other 34 positive reviews, however, several praised the game for being between 7 and 10 hours long, and 12 of them compared Mervils to games such as Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, Crash Bandicoot, Mario 64, and the Legend of Zelda series. Keeping in mind that it's hard to judge a VR game without seeing it in VR, and how highly the reviews were praising it, I decided to buy Mervils for myself and embark on my epic adventure. Mechanically, Mervils works in a similar fashion to all the games it's compared to. You run around a 3D environment, jump, attack, sometimes launch yourself out of cannons to reach higher areas, use portals like the one in Spyro to reach new levels, you have a sword, collect things, and solve puzzles. Beyond these broad generalizations, it's hardly fair to compare these classic games to Mervils. But here at Video 2, we don't care about what's fair, so let's dive a little deeper into these comparisons. In a fully voice-acted introduction, something Banjo-Kazooie didn't have, it's explained that the Great Mervil Book was used to protect the kingdom with a magical force field, but after the wizard Balazar used the book over 200 years ago to turn himself into a more badass version of a Lich from World of Warcraft, the book was taken apart and the pages scattered in order to keep others from gaining tremendous power. Unfortunately, this plan started to backfire when it was discovered that the force field protecting the kingdom could not be maintained without the completed book. As Balazar's power continued to grow, it was decided that the need for an ironclad defense outweighed the risk of further misuse, and it falls on the player to gather all of the pages and defeat Balazar. Reading between the lines, it's not hard to see that this is clearly an allegory of nuclear deterrence. For those unfamiliar, nuclear deterrence is the theory adopted during the Cold War proposing that no two nations that possessed nuclear capabilities, in this case the power of the Great Mervil Book, would use these weapons against each other in fear of mutually assured destruction. This can be seen in-game by how Balazar does not attempt to threaten the Mervil Kingdom in over 200 years, but after learning that the Mervils no longer possess a deterrent, he starts to go on the offensive. It's at this point that I would like to mention that the force field employed by the Mervils functions similarly to the Iron Curtain, the symbolic border employed by the Soviet Union from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War, and that it's designed to keep all foreign entities out and control the flow of information. The introduction is given by a nameless narrator, who assures the player that Balazar is the enemy, despite his only crime being a desire for more power, and then it falls to the player to re-establish a deterrent, not for a reward or because they volunteered, but because it is their duty as a Mervil. The player's second source of information, Merlin, who acts as a handler throughout the adventure, introduces himself as an authority figure and gains the player's trust by stating that they may remember him from when they were a child, yet as soon as an external source of information, the dragon Darthaid, appears, Merlin begins to attack him and urges the player to do the same. With all this in mind, it may be safe to assume that the idyllic society of the Mervil Kingdom may in fact be a communist one. At this point in the review, we are mere minutes into the game and we already have a backstory that far surpasses...
Please come to the castle. I have baked a cake for you.
In fact, the opening to Mervils can be compared to a game from an entirely different genre, both on thematic scale and in context. Metal Gear Solid. While a lot of games touch on the topic of nuclear weapons and the theory of nuclear deterrence, no game that I've seen does so with such care and fidelity since Metal Gear, and Mervils acknowledges these similarities by allowing the player to make a near-perfect copy of Big Boss from the ending of Metal Gear Solid 5, as well as placing red exclamation points over the head of alerted NPCs. After leaving Hero Creation Village, the player is brought to one of the most thought-out overworlds in modern video games. From the starting position, the player can see the guide Merlin standing in front of them with an icon that clearly indicates that he can be spoken to. Behind Merlin are the 4 portals leading to the individual world hubs, which allow the player to quickly travel to specific levels. To the left of the starting point are some training dummies, and just like the first block in level 1-1 of Super Mario Bros., hitting them rewards the player with some coins, acting as positive reinforcement for the player to keep hitting things as they explore the levels. Heading to the right of the map, the player encounters Benedict, who allows the player to travel back to Hero Creation Village if they want to buy new gear to raise their stats, such as maximum health and attack power. On the furthest left and right edges of the map, the player encounters 2 cliffs that can only be climbed using bouncing mushrooms. This allows players to practice platforming, the most necessary and fundamental skill needed to progress through the game, in a risk-free environment. On the top of the left cliff lies a practice catapult, and on the right a practice ballista, which operates in a similar fashion to the catapult, but is superior in every regard. This may be a reference to how nuclear weapons, often referred to as spears, can outperform all other conventional weapons. Everything else in the level serves to reinforce what we already know about the kingdom from the introduction. The castle, symbolizing the government, takes up a large portion of the map but is behind the player's starting position, implying that they are working from out of sight or from the shadows. More literally, it serves as an example of how those in power, as well as those who serve them, get to live an easy life compared to those around them. While the guards at the castle stand idly by, the other Mervils are hard at work chopping trees. The only other Mervil we see that isn't working is also the only Mervil we see that doesn't have a proper house. This dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots strengthens the notion that what is good for the kingdom is good for the Mervil. Throughout the overworld, as well as the rest of the game, the player can actually find the phonographs that play the background music. While acting as a sort of visual gag, it also takes a nearly omnipresent element in most video games and makes it a physical entity. This demystification of a game element both helps strengthen player immersion and pushes the notion that everything is within the Mervil's control. There is no god or mysterious force responsible for the background music, it is simply something that they created. The belief that there is no god is just another similarity between the Mervil kingdom and a Marxist society. After traveling through the overworld portal, the player is brought to another hub which offers a stylized preview of what the next few levels are going to look like thematically, and each level introduces a new concept or mechanic for the player to learn. The first level introduces the player to the idea of completing quests, finding pages of the Great Mervil book, and most importantly, combat. While reviewers are right to compare the general gameplay to that of early collectathons, I would have to argue that combat plays like a different game entirely, specifically, Bloodborne. Unlike games like Legend of Zelda or even the Souls games, you don't have a shield and combat is focused around killing the enemy before they can kill you. More difficult enemies often drop a heart after defeating them, mimicking how your health is restored in Bloodborne. This first level also introduces a gold sink, a device used most notably in the Spyro the Dragon series in the form of Mr. Moneybags. A gold sink requires the player to pay a usually hefty price in return for game progression, and serves to reduce inflation in players that have too much gold, and also incentivizes players who don't have enough gold to go back and explore the level more. It is possible that these gold sinks could also represent the redistribution of wealth in a communist society, but it is unlikely seeing as the only example of a gold sink is in the form of a thief, which would work against the rest of the game's seemingly communist standpoint. At the end of the first world, an NPC tells us a very important piece of information. You can only use items in the world that they were found in. This lets players know that unlike early adventure games like Zelda, puzzles aren't going to have convoluted solutions based on earlier levels. In game design, this is known as compartmentalization, and it allows the game designers to focus on each level at a time, leading to better, more individualized levels. The second level introduces several new game mechanics such as new platform types, tightrope walking, puzzles, an escort quest, and cannons that strongly resemble those from Super Mario 64. While the cannons from both franchises function in a very similar fashion, I would have to say that the Mervil's cannons are just slightly superior in the regard that they prioritize player speed and progression through the level over the spectacle of soaring through the air. In the final countryside level, we meet the dragon Darthate, a servant of Balazar who urges the player to give up on their journey and defect. After being antagonized by Merlin, Darthate begins to attack the castle before being put down by the player. Thematically, we don't learn much from the countryside world or the Darthate encounter that we don't already know. However, it fulfills an important role preparing the player for what is to come. In this regard, the countryside world acts as a near-perfect foil to the next world, the Wild West, which is comprised of a minecart level, a puzzle level, and a boss encounter with a golem. At first glance, it may appear that the game has foregone its thematic storytelling in favor of more diversified gameplay. But as we learn from the Ghost of Augustine, it is in fact giving the player a brief glimpse of three other factions heavily involved in the events that took place near the end of World War II leading to the start of the Cold War, but from the perspective of the Soviet Union, namely Americans, the Nazis, and the Jewish people. While there are plenty of movies that are set in World War II that can inspire patriotism, or that were even used as propaganda films at the time, American Westerns were an incredibly influential genre, even influencing filmmaking in the East during the Cold War. The prevalence of American Westerns perpetuated the stereotype that Americans acted like cowboys, which can be seen throughout the first Wild West level. The next level focuses heavily on mystic puzzles in a much more Egyptian setting. This is a reference to how Nazis started research into the occult in the early 1940s, coinciding with their Egyptian offensive. The fact that no one was able to solve the puzzle and beat the level until the player arrives also mirrors how the Nazi offensive wasn't stopped until the arrival of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery in the fall of 1942, who on an unrelated note reminds me of my dad mixed with Bryan Cranston, so this level hit especially close to home for me. Unlike the mysticism used in the second level, the golem that serves as the boss encounter for the Wild West world has roots dating back to the founding of Judaism. While the context and subtleties have changed greatly over thousands of years, the basic notion that a golem is a living being created from non-living materials remains a constant. The idea that a being of immense power could be made from almost nothing became a source of hope for a lot of Jewish people during the Holocaust. This can be seen in short stories such as The Golem of Auschwitz and games like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. In the context of Mervils, however, it is the first time that Balazar has built up the resolve to have the player killed instead of delayed, but even at this point he is unwilling to personally commit the act or have another living creature do it on his behalf. While the Wild West world served to give us a glimpse outside of the Iron Curtain, the next world, the Arctic Isles, gives us an opportunity to look inside it. Besides the obvious climate comparisons, there are a few other subtle hints we can look at to solidify the notion that we are inside the Soviet Union. The first is that on the second island, we see a wizard who we helped by giving him some magic scrolls in the first level betray us, much like how Germany betrayed Russia in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. The lava pools scattered across the level scorch the land around it, and the enemies attack quickly before retreating great distances. These were both tactics employed by Russia when fighting off the Nazi invasion. The last hint we have is that one of the level's quests involve helping a farmer who is trying to grow carrots in the Arctic but is failing. This is a clear metaphor for how Nikita Khrushchev, who was in charge of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964, often proposed ineffective policies for agricultural reform, which would mean that the scattered islands throughout the level represent different political factions vying for power at the time. This metaphor is a little too on the nose for true PSVR. After a brief transitional level and a boss fight representing the perceived threat from within the Soviet Union, the player is ready to move on to the last world, Paradise Cove. I would like to take a moment to mention how you do not actually kill the boss in the third world, but instead freeze him, rendering him unable to attack. It's been heavily debated whether or not this is in reference to how Khrushchev was not killed when he was removed from power, but instead given a pension and a home in the countryside. Personally, I think the fire boss did get a home in the country. Paradise Cove differs from all the other levels in that it finally prioritizes plot over subtext. After learning of a buried treasure rumored to have hundreds of pages from the Great Mervil book, the player must gather a crew and ship off to retrieve it. Unfortunately, after an intense sea battle that puts Sid Meier's pirates to shame, the ship sinks after colliding with a massive coral reef. Despite the setback, the player is ultimately able to find the treasure chest they are searching for. However, instead of containing hundreds of pages from the Great Mervil book, it only contains one message. After Merlin urges the player to follow him to a place where nobody can eavesdrop, the letter is read explaining that the Great Mervil book has no power and that it is simply the Mervil's strong belief in the book that protects the kingdom. The letter continues and explains that it is this same belief that will empower the player to defeat Balazar, but that the truth needs to remain a secret from the other Mervils in order for it to work. A similar message can be found if the player finds all the secret words scattered throughout the game. This is an example of Plato's noble lie, or the concept that it is sometimes in the best interest of the people if they are lied to, or that certain information be kept from them. But it is also untrue. At the very start of the game, we learn that Balazar was only able to transform into a lich due to the power of the Great Book, and it was decided by those in charge, the same people that would be aware if the book had no power, to scatter the pages. If it were simply the Mervil's belief in the book that gave it strength, then scattering the pages would have no effect, and it would have been in the government's best interest to instead destroy it completely and reinstill the Mervil faith into a more controllable entity, such as a king for instance. Keeping this in mind, the author of both of the messages denouncing the Great Mervil book's power is never seen, and the player is still encouraged to gather the pages, demonstrated by the fanfare every time all the pages in a level are collected. Knowing all of this, it becomes incredibly suspicious that Merlin, the one sent to assist the player in their journey, is waiting for them by the chest containing the message miles off the coast of the island that they were originally supposed to find it at, and that Merlin teleports the player out of the zone, leaving the shipwrecked crew at sea in shark-infested waters. After one last encounter with Balazar in which the player finally defeats him, Merlin awards the player with a gold and red crown, the colors most often associated with the Soviet Union, and declares that they are now the new king of the land, a figurehead title demonstrated by the fact that either there was no king prior to this decision, or that Merlin holds the power to usurp kings on a whim. With Balazar exterminated, the Great Mervil book restored, and the trust of the new king and nation behind him, Merlin is free to rule the kingdom from the shadows as he sees fit. Mervils does a masterful job of retelling the classic hero's journey but set in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and for that I give it 2 thumbs up. And a 4 out of 10. This review is brought to you by Mervil Redenbacher's Popcorn, the first and last name in popcorn. If you like this video, please consider subscribing for more video. Thanks for watching.